Clean, Green, and Healthy Tribal Schools Initiative. These are scheduled every Wednesday through February 22nd at the same time. Several of the programs are double features, such as the two programs that you will enjoy today. You are joining 83 other guests from communities, tribes, government agencies, universities, engineering, and architectural firms. Thank you for your interest in the health of our schools and our communities. This is a very participative session, and there are 4 ways that you'll be invited to participate in this and the other webinars in the series. Following the presentation, we're going to invite you to ask your questions. You may simply raise your hand, and if you notice on the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen, just simply click on the symbol of the hand that you see there. During the question and answer session, I can open your microphone so that you can ask your question on the air. Other participants will hear your question and the presenter's answer. You may also submit a question by typing it in the question box in the lower part of the panel. I'll forward that question on to the presenter. You'll remain anonymous unless you ask me to include your name when I send on the question. We want to know what you know and what you learn from participating in the webinar. So we've included 2 polls in which you'll be invited to participate. When you leave the session, you'll also be asked to respond to 4 multiple choice survey questions, and these should take you 50 seconds or less to complete. In addition to today's 2 programs, 10 more webinar topics will be covered in the next 5 Wednesdays, including asbestos awareness and lead-based paint renovation, repair, and painting rule, which comes up next Wednesday. Please join us for any or all of these programs. Links for registration can be found at www.epa.gov/region8/tribal schools. I want to introduce you to the speakers that will be participating in our series of webinars. We have people who are experienced professionals, experts in their field, and you will be meeting them as the webinars progress. I'd like to introduce the people behind the scenes of the Clean, Green, and Healthy Tribal Schools Initiative. At the top left is the contract manager, Matthew Langenfeld. Matthew is also our presenter today, and he is the Chemical Initiative Coordinator for the Pollution Prevention and Toxics Unit of the Environmental Protection Agency in Region 8. Sean Lopez, President and owner of Orion Environmental, is the Project Manager. Orion Environmental provides site assessments, abatement, removal, and inspections for schools and other buildings, also contracting and training. Finally, I am Dr. Carolina Smiley Marcus, the Project Coordinator and your facilitator for the webinars. I provide neutral and educational professional services, and I welcome you today in my language, Widan Gimu. Let me introduce Matthew Langenfeld. Matthew holds a master's in chemistry from South Dakota School of Mines and Technology. An environmental professional for 29 years, he has worked in industry and consulted with state and federal governments. He instructed college chemistry classes, laboratory courses, and has worked on school chemical cleanout and safety issues with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for nearly 6 years. During that time, he helped to develop school chemical cleanout programs in Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and South Dakota. His accomplishments include the cleanout of 123,000 pounds of toxic chemicals from 267, 88 of these in Indian country, making schools safer for 96,000 school children. So let's begin by inviting you to participate in the poll, if you would. We want to see what you now know before Matthew gives you the answers. All right, so if you will respond to this poll. If 3% have voted. All right, getting lots of votes in, Matthew. Almost 100% have voted. So we'll close the poll and share the results. a little bit of a tie here. We've got 100% saying unsafe exposure to children and staff, fire and explosions, lost school days, high cleanup costs, and bad press. Thank you very much. All right, so let's turn the program over now to Matthew.
Okay, thank you very much, Carolina. Okay. With school chemical cleanout, we're interested in trying to make schools free from hazards associated with mismanaged chemicals. And we're looking to provide you with tools to assist you with that. So we'd like to encourage you to give us a call if you have any questions about this, and if we can help you in any way. We've had quite a bit of experience working with tribal schools with school chemical cleanout. So one thing that's important is, do we know where all the chemicals are stored in our schools and how long they've been there? And why should we be concerned about them? We should be concerned about them because they may be a health risk. So one important point that I would like to make is it's important to have an inventory of chemicals. If there's nothing else that you do at your school with chemical management, the first most important thing you could do is to do an inventory. And these pictures that Carolina has provided us to the right there show something that's common in schools, and that is to have crystals form on the lid of chemical bottles. On the left, upper left there's a, looks like it might be a sulfuric acid bottle, and it's common for these acids to seep through the lids and for the crystals to form, and you wouldn't want anyone to touch those and then maybe transfer that to their face, their eyes, where they might burn themselves. So we have found that there are many chemicals in our schools that may be dangerous to school children and to school personnel. And these chemicals can cause contaminated air, injury or illness, or even fire or an explosion. And this picture that we have to the right there shows a fume hood where air is being pulled across the bench there. And this is supposed to be used for mixing chemicals and for reacting chemicals, and not for storage. So this is a practice that we shouldn't be seeing. So there has been a school in Nevada that was closed for 2 weeks due to spill of liquid mercury, and that cleanup cost over $100,000 to clean up. So this is the kind of circumstance that we'd like to avoid, and it's easy to avoid that by making sure that that mercury was never there in the school in the first place so that it could be spilled. And that mercury probably could have been disposed of for maybe even as low as $100. Okay, so in the previous slide, it went past fast enough, and I'm not able to go back with that. Back to the previous slide. See, Carolina's, okay, great, thank you. Carolina was able to move it back. So backing up one, from 2002 to 2007, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry analyzed 423 toxic chemical spills, and they basically did a poll of 15 states, and they found evidence of 895 injuries and 11 hospitalizations from various spills at schools, various chemical spills. So, it is a circumstance that does happen on occasion at schools, and one that we're trying to avoid. So one thing we want to avoid, which occasionally we do see, is the out of sight, out of mind mentality, where chemicals may be in a storeroom, or they may be in a chemical closet, and they're just sitting there, and no one's really dealing with those. And those can cause fires, explosions, and produce harmful vapors. And when these unmanaged and forgotten stockpiles of chemicals not properly dealt with, they are a potential danger. So we have found that chemicals can be dispersed throughout the school in many different locations, and sometimes school administrators are unaware of the amount, location, age, and toxicity. And sometimes staff are not trained to manage the risk of these chemicals, and a lot of schools don't have the time or budget to deal with chemical storage space and equipment and inventory needs. And children tend to be more vulnerable to the toxicity of these chemicals, and children also are inquisitive, and sometimes they can experiment on their own with these chemicals, and we don't want to have unsupervised circumstances. And a lot of times we find that it's best to remove the bulk of chemicals from the school to try to avoid this. And unmanaged chemicals increase the risk for everyone. So why should your school conduct a clean out? Well, it's just for that reason, is to manage the chemicals and to reduce the potential risk of exposure to staff and the school children. So one of the most important things that we'll reiterate here is that it's important to make a complete and accurate inventory. And we would like to suggest that this is done at least annually. And then secondarily, from that list, determining what chemicals should be properly disposed due to their unsafe health risks. And then we would suggest that a one-time clean out would be completed. And one of the challenges, of course, is finding funding for that clean out. And I would like to mention that most schools are not regulated. Their chemicals are not regulated by the EPA. But if a school has over 220 pounds of hazardous chemicals or over 2.2 pounds of acutely hazardous chemicals, they may be regulated, and they may be regulated by the EPA and by the state. And also we notice that a lot of schools don't use the majority of chemicals that they have on hand. So we'd like to recommend that only those chemicals that are needed and used within a couple of years should be kept on hand. Reducing the number and volume of chemicals through a clean out would therefore reduce risk. So are there any unsafe chemicals or unsafe storage of chemicals at your school? Well, if it looks like either one of these two examples that we have here, we would suggest that maybe you do need a clean out. On the left, we found a school that had a lot of paints and tars and oils that were just stacked up in a storage area in the school, and we did assist that school in that clean out. On the right, you know, it looks pretty neat and organized, and it is, and there is an inventory hanging there. However, 90% of the chemicals on this shelf have never even been opened, and we would suggest that those chemicals that are not being used should be properly disposed. So here's some pictures of some chemicals that we found in tribal schools. And on the left, there's a picture of mercury. If you looked at in the corner there, there's a Gatorade bottle that's full of mercury. And the mercury is probably evaporating through the lid, you know, through the screw part of the lid on that bottle. And there's students that have been sitting for years within 20 feet of where these chemicals were stored. There's 21 pounds of mercury in that Gatorade bottle. So that, you know, all of these circumstances you see here were ones that we found, and then we also assisted the school in taking care of these. In the center there's a picture of potassium cyanide in a box, and this particular school was keeping all of their most hazardous chemicals in one box, and the potassium cyanide was kept right next to a container of arsenic acid. So if acid and potassium cyanide get together and mix, they can create hydrogen cyanide, which can cause death in the worst case scenario. On the right, there's a container of benzene that was found in a tribal school that was in an acid cabinet. And there shouldn't be any benzene in a school because it is a known carcinogen. And if there were a spill, we just wouldn't want to have that exposure with the students or the staff. And, we did find this before this container leaked, but, given enough time, this container probably would have rusted through from the acid corrosion and exposed the students. So we've got some more examples here. On the left, we've got a picture of yellow phosphorus, and that yellow phosphorus is kept in water, and that's because yellow phosphorus is a very strong oxidizer, and if it gets in the presence of air, it can oxidize, and it can burn or cause a fire. And there's 4 ounces of yellow phosphorus here. It may be okay for the teacher to have a small amount of this to demonstrate to the students, but this is, in our opinion, is too large of an amount. And if the water were to evaporate from this just sitting on the shelf over years, it may actually start to oxidize rapidly all of a sudden if the water level dropped. And then next to that is a container of potassium metal with oil in it, and if that comes in contact with water, that also will rapidly oxidize and could potentially burn someone. In the middle, we have some radioactive compounds that were found in a tribal school, and those compounds were collected and properly disposed. And on the far right, there's some hydrofluoric acid that was found at a school. This particular acid is one of the strongest acids that we have, and it's really not something that should be found in a school. It was never opened and never used, and it's just an accident waiting for a place to happen. Another thing that is sometimes common is incompatible storage. On the left there, we have an example of formaldehyde. There's critters in those containers, and that red liquid is formaldehyde formalin solution that has leaked out of some of these containers. And in this particular tribal school, the sun had shone through the window and heated up that material, and the formaldehyde, which is a carcinogen, was getting into the room, and the students had to evacuate that room. And that's, again, not something that you want to see. In the middle there, we have potassium and sodium hydroxide that is oozing out of the container because it's come in contact with humidity and absorbed up water and pushed through the container. And again, if a student were to touch that with their fingers and then touch their skin or touch their eyes, they could get a burn. And we've got nitric acid with more crystals forming on the top. On the far right, upper right there, is an unknown material. And that is also something that's very common. We could not read the label, and it's a little more difficult to deal with unknown materials, and they're a little more expensive. And down here in this corner, the acids and bases were combined on the same shelf, and if they were to mix, you could potentially have a reaction with some spattering and generation of heat, which again could maybe splash into a student's eyes. So there's a lot of circumstances there that we'd like to avoid. So we also find on occasion that there can be chemicals in art classrooms, and in this particular cabinet we have glazes that are used for pottery, and a lot of these glazes in this cabinet had fritted lead, and also there were some chromium and cadmium in some of these compounds. So that's, again, not something that we would recommend at the school. And there was a clay pottery furnace in the same room with the children, and we wouldn't want any lead to be liberated into the air and breathed by the children. Here are some maintenance chemicals. On the left, we have some duplicating fluid, and there's methanol in those containers. And if someone were to drink that, They can potentially go blind. It's a toxic compound. And then we've also got some xylene that's used as a floor stripper, as a maintenance compound. And it's toxic to the central nervous system and also an irritant. It's not nearly as bad as benzene, but it is a toxic compound. So we've decided that we should do a clean out at our school. How should we start? Well, again, the best place to start is to conduct a school-wide inventory. So it might be a good idea to go through your school and do a quick assessment and find out where all your chemicals are at, and then attack each one of these areas separately and do a separate inventory for each of these areas. And it's also important to keep track of the information that's listed here, the name of the chemical, the trade name, ingredients, percentages, phone numbers, container size and type, the condition of the container, is it leaking, is the seal broken, are there notes on the bottles, what's the weight and volume, and what's the chemical name, or is it an unknown? So I mentioned the school-wide assessment. Now, chemicals can be found in buildings, warehouses, art, drama, locked areas, laboratories, maintenance grounds, sheds, closets, and shops. So they could be just about anywhere. So we've provided an example of a chemical inventory sheet, and if you need an electronic copy of this, we can send it to you. Someone actually requested this yesterday, and I sent it to a tribal school for them to keep track and for them to go through their chemicals and do an inventory. And then here is an example of the information that would be included in the inventory. So the first compound listed there is sulfuric acid, and there were 2 containers. The container size was 1 liter, and the container type was G for glass. You can see the key at the bottom, and the physical state is L for liquid, and there's a key at the bottom to help you. So it's pretty straightforward, pretty easy. Now, one thing that's confusing is, let's say there were 2 containers of sulfuric acid, but one of them was half full. The hazardous waste brokers that do these actual cleanouts of chemicals want to know the size of the container and maybe not necessarily how much material is in that container. Now, you could include that if you wished, but it's more important for them to know the total size of the container. So once you've done your inventory and you've decided to do a clean out, we would recommend that you find a professional and a waste broker who is permitted to collect these materials and send them to a treatment, storage, and disposal facility. And we'd recommend that you get 3 bids because the cost can vary quite a bit, and make sure that the bidders are capable, and give the bidders a date to report back to you. That's something that's important because it can go on for quite some time. So our goals for the schools are to remove hazardous chemicals, manage the chemical inventories, promote pollution prevention techniques, and best practices to reduce laboratory hazards.
Thank you, Matthew.
So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Carolina.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you for participating in the webinar. We're going to get to your questions next, but we hope that Matthew's presentation on school chemical cleanout has added to or refreshed your knowledge of the issue. And we're going to ask you again to respond to a poll, and I do apologize. For some reason, question number 1 didn't come up, so you should get 2 questions this time. And if you will just respond to the poll. Chemicals that have not been managed could result in, and remember in the last time we had 100% and 85% down the row. So Matthew, we've got 20% of our participants have voted. It's coming in quickly. They listened well, it looks like. Almost everyone has voted. I know some people are in front of monitors and can't really vote, but do that mentally if you would. All right, the voting is slowed down, so we'll close the poll and we'll share the results with you. a little bit of change in the numbers. Matthew, do you have any comments about the responses?
Thank you, Carolina. Yes, I do. You know, I'd like to apologize because we made an error on our part, and the correct answer isn't actually on that list. These answers are all correct, and unfortunately, the GoToWebinar software won't allow you to have 6 possible answers. It'll only allow up to 5, and the right answer, which got cut off, was all of the above. So we apologize for that, and but the good side is you're all correct.
Well, our participants were able to vote more than one time, and so that's why you see different numbers of votes, but several people voted many times, I think. And so thank you. Well done. So let's look at the next one. And this one is a little quicker. Children and adults can be exposed to harmful level of, oops, gosh, I'm ahead of ourselves here, and I do apologize. So we'll hold this one for the next presentation. Close the poll and move on. All right. So Matthew, if you'll advance the screen if you're ready. All right, so we want to ask you if you have any questions. Does anyone have questions of Matthew? And remember that if you have a question you'd like to ask out loud, just raise your hand electronically. There's a little hand on the control panel of your screen, or send in a question. Here's a question for you, Matthew. How do you ensure that the bidders are capable? Thank you.
That's a very good question, and I was thinking about that myself. And you know, what I really would recommend is that, you know, you talk to someone like myself for my area, or talk to someone at your state or your local EPA office who has worked with these various contractors to do this type of work. And people in my area, when they contact me, I'll give them some options of, you know, maybe 3 or 4 different companies that are capable of doing this work. You can also maybe ask them for an example. You know, they should be using a manifest and shipping papers and land disposal restriction and shipping it to a treatment, storage, and disposal facility. And if they're able to respond in that manner, they likely are capable of doing the work.
So Matthew, one of our participants, Daniel, has suggested that you send out the clean-out form to all the participants.
Oh, you mean the inventory?
I'm betting that's what he means. Daniel, do you want to clarify that? I believe he means the inventory. Is that possible?
Inventory example. Yes, we will do that.
Okay. All right. Are there any more questions? Oh. Yes, he says the inventory. Okay. There's a little slowdown on getting the questions in our form as well. So while he's doing that, can he also send copies of the slides in the presentation?
Yes, we will also send the slides.
All right. Any other questions? Question here from Lyle. Is the MSES the same thing as MSDS?
I'm sorry, not in this case. The MSDS is a material safety data sheet, and Montana State's Environmental Services was the company that provided us with an example of an inventory that they use on a very regular basis for schools. So that is different.
All right, any other questions? Anyone want to ask a question on the air? I don't see any hands up. We've got some people with a lot of experience in this area on our list. And so if you have something to add, please let us know. We'd be glad to have you on the air to do that. All right, and any other questions that you'd like to send in the question box? All right, Matthew, I think that we've answered the questions, at least for now. And we've got Matthew's contact information. We've presented that several times. You'll see that again, not only at the end of this webinar, but also in the next webinar on PCBs.